Hi, Mick McQuaid here to talk to you about design and technology selection. And of course, the first thing to think about is conveniently displayed on this slide. Who are you? And what is your environment? Who are you talking to? You may be the designer, or you may be somebody working with the designer. In either case, you need to know about the designer and the designer's environment. And the designer is always thinking about the user, but the designer is always interacting with the manager and the developer. So that's the designer's environment. Next question is, what are you doing? So you may be pursuing any of several different design strategies. For example, you may be pursuing iterative design. In that case, you'd better be very quick. You'd better be able to go through the design, prototype, evaluate cycle once a week between weekly meetings. You may be pursuing the design thinking process, in which case you need to really know each of the stages of this classical diagram of the process, and you need to know which stages you can cut corners in during any given particular project. You may be pursuing goal-directed design, which is a helpful process for producing results on tight deadlines in heterogeneous teams. And if you do use goal-directed design, you'd better be intimately familiar with all these details and understand them not only as a designer, but also as a developer and as a manager. By the way, this image and a couple of the previous images are from the book About Face 4.0, published in 2014 by Cooper and Ryman. Can't remember how you pronounce their name. Very valuable book for the design process, for the goal-directed design process. You may pursue universal design, especially if you're very concerned with accessibility and inclusivity. You may be pursuing value-sensitive design, which is particularly, well, it's good for everybody, but it's particularly good for firms that have had ethical lapses in the past because it emphasizes ethics. Now back to who we're talking to. The developer doesn't know from personas. So, you as the designer have to realize that all the developer wants is a hi-fi prototype. And as a developer, you should know what the designer is up to, at least in passing. You don't need to know, all the details. You don't need to be able to directly use the following artifacts, but you should know about them. So first of all, the designer produces a lot of sketches and may ask the developer for feedback about them, but they're mostly for users and design testers to see. Storyboards are again mainly used for users and design testers to figure out the context around the digital artifact, be it an app, a website, or a kiosk. Personas represent a particular user of our digital artifact, and they're meant to help answer questions of the form, what would, in this particular example, Alexander Harris think of this feature? Scenarios are like storyboards, but more specific. They depict a successful use of the product. And these are all these things that I've just mentioned are supports for the designer to have a conversation with the manager and developer. But the designer must produce a hi-fi prototype. So that brings up the question, what do we mean by a hi-fi prototype? Well, here are two examples that illustrate the kinds of details that we should see in hi-fi prototypes: animations and transitions with exact timings. Now, what technology do you use to produce these prototypes? Well, the best technology has always been paper and pencil, or marker and whiteboard, so you'd better get used to it, and you may as well get good at it, because you'll be doing it a lot. But the flavor of the month is definitely Figma for designers. Why? Because it's free and collaborative. And that matters a lot in student and group projects. But it may not matter so much in the workplace. But luckily, almost all hi-fi prototyping software has pretty much the same interface nowadays. So it's very easy to learn other hi-fi prototyping software. And that brings us to Figma, which is an alternative to Framer that emits JavaScript. So this is extremely valuable if you're working with a developer who's coding in JavaScript. And given the popularity of JavaScript, you may as well learn it, in addition to Figma. And in addition to other tools, because the flavor of the month changes next month. So don't get too wedded to any particular tool. A piece of advice I'd like to offer you is to follow good designers and developers and see what they're up to. It's a really good way to learn about new technology choices. Let me give you an example of Takuya Matsuyama, somebody I follow, and that you should find designers and developers like him to follow. Since he likes some certain technology, I'm automatically curious about that technology. And by the way, don't discount the possibility that you're designing for several different platforms. Everybody wants their desktop apps to run on phones these days. Now here are some links to industry design guidelines that you should know. And these are all live links, and I'll give you the link to this slideshow so that you can click on them in case you can't Google material design. So material design, including Material U, keeps changing from year to year. So you need to stay up to date on their website and on their YouTube videos. Apple Human Interface Guidelines, and there are different ones for iOS, for Mac OS, for Watch OS, and for TV OS. Fluent Design, that's Microsoft's current design platform, and it includes a lot of useful code that you can share with developers. Inclusive Design is Microsoft's accessibility effort. IBM Design Language. That's specific to IBM products, but it is a great guide for general design, and it has plenty of code. So all designers should at least have a passing familiarity with it, as should developers. Now you just can't believe how important multi-platform apps are for designers. So be flexible about the platform. I'm even using, for example, on my iPhone, GitHub through an app called Working Copy. So let me summarize now. The designer follows a process. The designer talks to the developer and the manager about the user, and the designer uses technologies. So the process may be iterative, it may be design thinking, it may be value-sensitive design or universal design, but there's some process always being followed. You should know what that process is. The designer, when talking to the developer or the manager, uses props that you should be familiar with, personas, sketches, scenarios, and most of all, a hi-fi prototype. And of course, the designer uses technologies, paper and pencil, Figma, Framer, and other technologies that feed the developer. And that's it. That's the end of my slideshow. I do have a brief colophon to add. The slideshow is produced using an R package called Sharingan. The theme is Solarized Light. The fonts are Fira Sans, and Fira Sans condensed, and I didn't have any code, so there's no Fira code here. And this presentation is available at mickmcquaid.com/design and text select. And notice the capitals. It's camel case, design and text select. When you're running that slideshow, pressing H will give you the keyboard shortcut to get to presenter notes, which have some additional valuable information in them, and other worthwhile keyboard shortcuts you can use on this presentation. For more information, email me at mickmcquaid@gmail.com. And thank you very much for your attention.